My name is Bill Truels, and I'm going to talk today about the false narration which the Jfk pathologists used in the JFK assassination. It's kind of unusual. Pathologists can be pressured sometimes to provide another explanation, and we're going to go into some of the details here. The doctors at Parkland during the JFK assassination were pressured by LBJ to come up with a so-called deathbed confession. They wanted, LBJ had called Parkland Hospital and he wanted to tell Dr. Crenshaw to come up with a deathbed confession. And Dr. Crenshaw said, well, Mr. Oswald is unconscious. And LBJ kept saying, I want a deathbed confession that Oswald was the killer. So LBJ was pressuring the doctors at Parkland. And I believe that the doctors at Bethesda were similarly pressured to come up with a lone gunman explanation, that LBJ was busy telling people privately that he thought this was a conspiracy with Cuba or Russia, but at the same time he was saying that if the American people came to believe this, it could trigger World War III against Russia or Cuba. And this therefore was important. The pathologists conclude that this was a lone gunman. Now, in fact, what was in danger was LBJ's reputation. He was in the process of being indicted with the TFX scandal and other episodes, and the JFK assassination really prevented LBJ's reputation from nuclear destruction. So what did the pathologists do? They started doing an autopsy, and then they subsequently burned their notes and started over. And what they did is they changed the location of this wound in the back of the head, and they moved it up from the back of the posterior skull, the size of a baseball, up to the external occipital protuberance, the size of a marble, because they were basically changing an exit wound, a large exit wound, into a small entry wound and moving it up 4.5 inches. As Dr. Weck would say, Dr. Cyril Weck, that a 4-year-old child would know the difference between a large wound in the right posterior skull and a small one at the external occipital protuberance. How do you get confused and make such a dramatic change? Now, Dr. Gary Aguilar has researched the Parkland and Bethesda witnesses, and he counted 30 witnesses that said that there was a baseball-sized wound in the back of the head, a very large wound. The only two that differed were the pathologists at Bethesda, who I believe were pressured by LBJ, and they said, well, no, there's just a marble-sized wound in the external occipital protuberance up high, in order to create the idea that this was an entry wound from a lone gunman firing from the rear. So the other note that to be changed is that the size of the wound was changed from the size of a baseball, as Dr. Crenshaw described me, to the size of a marble. And again, this is a mistake that somebody could easily make. Now, another piece of evidence that was presented was a false photograph of the back of JFK's head and neck, which, in my opinion, was a photograph of a completely different person, showing the back of the skull to be intact. The photographers, in my opinion, used a different body to show the back of the head and the neck to be intact. Now, in the process, they had to add the shoulder wound to this new body, and they inadvertently placed it in the wrong position. Now, the pathologist gave a position of an entry wound in the upper shoulder that was more like the C7 or cervical level, rather than down at the T2 level farther down. Now, JFK had an exit wound at T2 at the sternal notch. We know that. So the controversy was over where this back wound is located. Now, they used a ruler that was 14 centimeters in length, and they put it in this is called the stylomastoid foramen, and then they measured back and said that the entry wound was back at that point. Now, I've measured a number of people, a number of adult men, with a 14 centimeter ruler, and I can't get the notch, the entry wound, to go more than the C7 level on adult men. Each vertebra is about 2 centimeters in height, and the 7th vertebra would be 14 centimeters down from the base of the skull. So the C7 position, and you can feel that if you bend your head down, you can feel the knot in the back of your neck. That's the C7 position, and that's really the position that the pathologist described. They also said that the cupola of the lung was bruised, but no pneumothorax, which again argues for a C7 instead of a T2 entry wound in the back. And also the right transverse process of T1 was nicked on X-ray, which was consistent with a downward path with a C7 entry and a T2 exit from a lone gunman firing from an elevated position in the rear. So the controversy over the entry wound, I believe, is that the entry wound was falsely placed by the photographers who were using a different body because they were trying to show everybody that the back of the head was intact for JFK in order to promote the idea of a lone gunman firing from the rear with a small entry wound. There's also the riddle of the missing brain. We know that large fragments of brain tissue were present lying on the trunk and the back seat of the car. I'm sorry to be gross about this, but it's important because even Nurse Diana Bowron stated that through this baseball-sized hole, she was able to put her hand inside of it and pack the skull, which was still oozing. So you're talking about a big hole with a significant amount of brain that was blown away by this bullet. And yet the pathologists, in order to promote the idea of a bullet, non-frangible, non-exploding bullet from the rear, said that the brain was mostly intact and said that it weighed actually 1,500 grams, which was more than a normal brain weighs. And yet we know that much of the brain was missing in Dealey Plaza, was blown away. So again, the pathologists had to provide a false narrative as to the weight of the brain to promote the idea of a lone gunman firing a non-exploding bullet from the rear. And then, of course, they had to lose the brain and lose the slides of the brain and lose the pictures of the brain because they had lied about the weight of the brain and maintained that the brain was mostly intact when in fact much of it had been blown away. So they had to fudge about the brain and the size of the brain. They had to fudge about the location and size of the wound in the back of the head. Now, most recently, Dr. Mantic and Dr. Cyril Wecht, and also an article by Jim Mars, determined, Dr. Mantic, that the 6.5 millimeter metal fragment seen on the skull X-ray was in fact an artifact. The density, optical density of that white circle on the skull X-ray was wrong, it was incorrect for what would have been a bullet at that point, and that this was added later by altering the X-ray and using a shadow box and other things to make a bright spot on that film. And Dr. Mantic has determined optical density-wise that this does not fit with a true X-ray of a bullet. And so we have evidence that the X-ray was also altered to promote the idea of a man shooting a 6.5 millimeter Carcano bullet from the rear. Now the question arises, what would you do if you were a military pathologist and you were pressured by your commander-in-chief who said, you're going to trigger World War III if you don't conclude that this was a lone gunman firing from the rear? So the pathologists burned their notes, and also Dr. Gerald Custer says that he was told to burn his logbook of x-rays that were taken. Dr. Edersol had told him to burn the logbook. So it's amazing with these burned records that they didn't set off the smoke alarm there at the morgue by burning all these initial records that were taken. So there was a cover-up going on. The other cover-up that happened was that the news media comes along, and here you've got 30 witnesses, Bethesda and Parkland, that say there's a baseball-sized hole in the back of the head. You've got 2 pathologists who say, oh no, it was the size of a marble up high. And so what does the news media do? They said, oh well, we're going to side with these pathologists because they're experts at knowing how big a hole is and where a hole is located. And this neurosurgeon, Dr. Kent Clark at Parkland, who's described a large hole in the back of the head, he's not as experienced as this pathologist, to determine how big a hole is in the back of the head. So the news media was part of this cover-up and supported these 2 pathologists in their explanation. So the JFK assassination raises an ethical dilemma, really, for pathologists. Do you simply report the truth as you were taught in medical school, or do you bow down to political pressure, provide a false narrative, which you are told is the greater good, and hope that history will forgive you. So what we're having here is the creation of a false history going into our history books. And the purpose of these videos is to try to put a more accurate account for future researchers to carry out with regard to the JFK assassination. In the next video, we're going to talk about the acoustics and how this can also be used as evidence.